If you thought the most devastating war in history was inevitable, you're about to discover how a series of catastrophic decisions turned regional conflicts into global hell. In this video, I'll show you exactly how three Axis nations dragged the entire world into total destruction, facing unexpected alliances and revolutionary technologies. So by the end, you'll understand why this war completely redefined humanity's destiny.
When I said Britain was completely alone, I wasn't being entirely accurate. The reality showed a more complex and strategic picture than it appeared at first glance. Numerous Commonwealth nations and various allied colonies had joined the war to back the British. Their participation wasn't merely symbolic. These forces would play an absolutely crucial role throughout the conflict, especially in the brutal African and Italian campaigns that were about to unfold. On the opposing side, Germany, Italy, and Japan formalized their alliance by signing the Tripartite Pact, a defensive alliance that intertwined their military destinies even more tightly and coordinatedly. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been a quick and decisive victory. Instead, it turned into a humiliating struggle that publicly exposed Soviet military incompetence to the entire world. Despite the difficulties, they finally managed to force the Finns to negotiate peace. The Soviets continued their campaign of intimidation against smaller nations, annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania without major international resistance. French colonies in equatorial Africa categorically rejected submitting to the collaborationist government and swore loyalty to Free France. Gabon was the exception, requiring military intervention to be integrated. The Allies also attempted to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that operation ended in a total failure that revealed the limitations of Allied coordination at that moment. But Mussolini's true ambitions were about to unleash a series of disasters that would completely change the balance of power. Mussolini had watched Hitler's crushing triumphs and decided it was time for Italy to shine with its own light on the world stage. His first move was attempting to conquer British Somaliland, an operation that turned out pretty successful and raised his confidence to dangerous levels. Encouraged by this initial success, he turned his attention toward Egypt. This campaign wasn't as favorable, and Italian forces began experiencing significant difficulties. Then he tried conquering Greece, and that effort turned out to be an absolute disaster that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the Italian army. Churchill started referring to Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe, openly favoring a military campaign from the south of the continent. He began sending British troops to Greece to capitalize on Italian weakness. This situation had Hitler genuinely worried. He moved quickly to protect his southern flank, which now looked dangerously vulnerable to Allied ambitions. Hitler had been cultivating diplomatic relations with Hungary and finally twisted the country's arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and officially joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join, seeking protection from the threatening Soviet Union that had annexed part of its territory. The Tripartite Pact had been strategically designed to prevent other nations from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, those pesky United States of America. While Europe was reorganizing, a silent battle in the Atlantic threatened to completely strangle Britain. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how strategic alliances can change the course of a war, because what's coming reveals the most crucial battle for Britain's survival.
When war first broke out, American public opinion was firmly against participating in another devastating European conflict. In the 1940 elections, the Republican candidate solemnly promised, "I will not send a single American boy to die in Europe." President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with a similar but more nuanced promise. "I won't send any American boys to die in Europe either, unless I have to. In that case, I might." Roosevelt won the election with this strategic ambiguity. Churchill begged him to join the war. Roosevelt responded, "Can't do it, Winston, but you know what? Here's some weapons." The United States started supplying the Allies with food and munitions in massive quantities, but there was a serious problem threatening the entire operation. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American vessels. If the Germans managed to cut Britain's supply line, the UK would literally starve to death. Throughout the war, the Allies had to develop superior technology to combat the submarines. Improved radar, longer-range aircraft, better weaponry, and more sophisticated convoy tactics. At one point, a man called a meeting and declared, "Pykrete. You take ice, add sawdust, you get pykrete." Then he pulled out a gun and shot at wood, which shattered. Then he shot at pykrete, and the bullet bounced off, hitting someone else in the conference room. They tried building a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea got scrapped because it was really absurd. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers managed to crack the German Enigma code, and U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat to Allied supply routes. But while the Allies celebrated this technological victory, Hitler was preparing the most massive land invasion ever conceived. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. The operation turned out surprisingly easy, so they kept advancing with renewed confidence. Hitler realized he'd finally have to step in personally and do something decisive. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia with a simple proposal. "I'm going to move troops through your territory to get to Greece, so either join us or, get invaded." Bulgaria wisely chose to join. Yugoslavia chose to get invaded. Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion, a victory that seemed to consolidate Axis dominance in the Balkans. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which allowed Rommel and his tank divisions to push the British back to Egypt. They could have kept advancing, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a crucial strategic port and completely disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem to pose any real threat for the moment. Hey, Soviet Union, watch out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest land invasion in history, and Stalin was completely unprepared. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him about an imminent attack, but he buried his head in the sand like a stubborn ostrich. The Soviets didn't stand a chance against the German war machine. Germany made astonishing progress with huge encircling movements, capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops: 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, almost 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was subjected to a siege that would last unbearable years of suffering and death. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred toward the ethnic peoples there now unleashed with all its ruthless fury. The Eastern Front of World War II was brutal for everyone who endured it, a frozen hell of unprecedented violence. The Germans were now inside Moscow. It was all over. But then something unexpected happened. It got cold, stupidly, intensely cold. Hitler had expected the Soviets to surrender before winter, but they kept fighting with unexpected tenacity. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep advancing," Hitler responded. "But the oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine, keep advancing. We have to leave our frozen horse carcasses by the roadside so we can find our way in the snowstorms." "Perfectly normal, keep advancing." Hitler hadn't provided his millions of men with winter clothing and supplies because he really thought he should have already won by this point. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in extreme cold. The Germans didn't stand a chance against these climate-adapted forces. Now they were being pushed back mercilessly. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for the deadly winter to end. While Germany froze in Russia, Japan was about to make the mistake that would wake the sleeping giant. Smash that subscribe button if these unexpected war twists are surprising you, because the most impactful decision that changed the entire conflict hasn't arrived yet. Germany's victories had been staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the global victory bus. Their war in China had reached a frustrating stalemate, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and obtain the precious raw materials they desperately needed. They started making plans to expand southward, but there was a monumental problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by the United States and Britain. It was also full of ocean, which meant intense naval combat. There was no way the Japanese Navy could simultaneously face the United States and the United Kingdom. So they thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could destroy their fleets before starting our conquest? That's how on December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of devastating damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia simultaneously. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and Churchill did the same immediately. Hitler then declared war on the United States, even though he totally didn't have to under the treaty. The Pearl Harbor attack seemed like a great Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval fuel storage tanks or the submarine base, which meant the Pacific Fleet would be back operational pretty soon. Meanwhile, the Japanese could begin their conquest at impressive speed. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through the country into Malaya. They steamrolled Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and now threatened northern Australia and India's borders. Japan's victory had been as astonishing as the Germans and reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war they were destined to win by celestial mandate. But their victories had been based on speed, not real power, and power would eventually catch up with them in the most brutal way. For now, in all occupied nations, people suffered persecution, forced labor, and harsh punishments for anyone who dared speak against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up defying their invaders as people clung to hope. And hope was coming.
Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his eastward push. But this time, he completely changed his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area loaded with oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil to fuel his war machine. His forces moved through the north easily, and Hitler became dangerously confident. He redirected the 4th Panzer Army south prematurely, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do it, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it with absolute ferocity, and Stalingrad saw some of the toughest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets stopped the German advance for 5 months while they battled in the war-devastated city, which bought them invaluable time. When the Germans had launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories eastward. Those factories had been building a massive quantity of tanks and planes, preparing the Soviet army from scratch. Now it was ready to counterattack. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that recalled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they started surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler responded, "No, you stay where you are." The entire 6th Army got trapped and had to surrender in total humiliation. With complete air superiority, the Soviets began pushing west relentlessly. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory that changed the entire momentum of the war. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe that marked the beginning of the end. Things didn't look too good for Hitler in other parts of the world either. With the United States now in the war, Allied bombing of German cities reached absolutely devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again, then they got pushed back again.
Finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein and with American and British troops arriving from the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed completely out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success dramatically reversed. They tried to take Midway Island, but the U.S. Navy was ready for the attack and sank the Japanese carriers. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle the Japanese Navy would never fully recover from. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the brutal jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They started realizing they weren't invincible after all. With the Axis reeling, the Allies had to decide how to deliver the final blow, and the decision would divide Churchill and the Americans. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next strategic move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred an invasion across the Channel in northern France. "All right," the Americans said, "we'll do it your way first." Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and started moving up through Italy. They also carried out devastating bombings on Rome, bringing the war to the symbolic heart of Italian fascism. The thing was, a lot of people in Sicily had family living in the United States, and they welcomed American troops with surprising warmth. With the war reaching the homeland, most Italians just weren't that committed to it. Mussolini suddenly became extremely unpopular among his own people. He was removed by his own Grand Fascist Council and overthrown from power in a dramatic fall. Italy immediately began surrender negotiations with the Allies. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements south in an operation he ironically called Operation Axis. German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north, securing control of the territory. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, bringing mud and slowing everything to a complete halt. "All right," the Americans said, "let's do it our way, too."
Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England, while factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy, massive invasion like the world had never seen before. The Germans knew an Allied invasion was coming, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to brilliant Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais. But the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under General Dwight Eisenhower's careful planning, the long-prepared invasion was almost ready to begin. Only one thing prevented the launch: unpredictable British weather. As everyone waited for a decent day, it finally arrived. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and attacked coastal defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a pretty chaotic operation. They were tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning came the massive bombardment as Allied ships fired a huge amount of shells at German fortifications. And then the landings began. Americans at Utah and Omaha, British at Gold and Sword, and Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, where enemy fire was merciless. But Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success that changed the course of the war. Then they began their movements inland with renewed determination. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen in intense fighting. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany, securing vital ports. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped a German 7th Army in an almost annihilating encircling movement. In August, Allied troops also landed in southern France with little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne in celebration. Paris was liberated in scenes of indescribable jubilation, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. While Europe was being liberated, in the Pacific, one of the most brutal campaigns ever seen was being fought.
In the Far East, the Allies began pushing the Japanese out of Burma with relentless determination. The Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific that tightened the noose around Japan more and more. In the South, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to return. Meanwhile, General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign, one of the bloodiest of the entire war. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on small, fiercely defended islands as they constantly moved toward mainland Japan. The Japanese belief that the greatest thing a person could do was die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender, meant they fought fiercely to the end. And the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the fiercer Japanese resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima after an incredibly bloody battle. An intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began, burning entire urban areas. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and now threatened Germany's industrial heartland. Hitler's health, both mental and physical, was rapidly deteriorating under the stress. Things looked bad, and he was desperate to change the course. "We need to turn this situation around, and I've got just the trick," Hitler declared. "Remember a few years ago when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do exactly the same thing again." He gathered his forces and tried to push them through the Ardennes with the last resources he had left. He used the remainder of Germany's strength and resources and managed to create a pretty considerable bulge in the Allied lines. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent a message to the trapped Americans saying, "Surrender or be annihilated." When it was read to the commanding officer, he said, "They want us to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent as their official response, a single word that became legend. General Patton's Third Army managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back in defeat. Hitler's desperate last-ditch attempt had failed miserably. What followed was a total collapse of German forces on all fronts. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides in a devastating pincer movement. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing toward Berlin mercilessly. In his underground bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a grand 1,000-year German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been eliminated. 1 remained to fall. But the final decision on how to end the war with Japan would divide history forever. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before reaching mainland Japan. The desperate Japanese fought with unprecedented intensity, launching kamikaze attacks against American ships in a terrifying display of fanaticism. Okinawan citizens suffered through the terrible fighting, trapped between 2 massive military forces. But in 2 brutal months, the island was finally captured. The Allies now had to make a choice that would define the rest of history. Either they continued the devastating fight up through mainland Japan, which would cost millions of lives, or they could try coercing the Japanese into surrendering using a completely new weapon. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. The United States and United Kingdom were also watching the Soviet Union, not so much liberating as occupying their captured territories, and they wanted to make a show of force. On August 6th, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble in an instant, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate beyond comprehension. But for the Allies, it achieved its main objective, forcing surrender without a costly invasion. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying, "The war situation has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage." After 6 devastating years, the war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years, rebuilding the nation from scratch. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this photograph was printed in the Japanese press to show the Japanese people that their emperor wasn't the divine, powerful being they'd believed. Germany was divided between the United States, United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union into occupation zones. In 1949, the Allied sectors united into West Germany, while the Soviet sector became East Germany. World War II had been more terrible and destructive than the first in every conceivable way. In its aftermath, 2 main superpowers with 2 very different ideologies had emerged victorious. The tension between the 2 of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold war. Hit that subscribe button if this video changed your perspective on how strategic and technological decisions determined the fate of millions. Because every week we break down the historical moments that completely redefined our world.